Okay, and do you see on your screen a slide that says the executive branch of Texas government? Online? Can you see that? Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so yeah, our topic for this week is the executive branch. Hold on to your seats. Yeah, you know, some of the topics that we cover in this class are more interesting, others are less interesting. Of course, as individuals, different things interest us. You may find this riveting, I don't know, but it's, you know, as of the topics that we cover in this course, I would not put this high on the list of, you know, what's interesting, but we still have to sort of, you know, press through it, and we'll try to do the best that we can to talk about things that are of interest, but there are some sort of mundane things that we have to sort of trudge through. So initially here, I want to just talk about some of the broad features of the executive branch. I think one of the points that I'd like to emphasize is something that we've already mentioned in passing in previous class meetings, and that is that the chief executive in Texas, the governor, is institutionally one of the weakest in the country. And we'll look at some indices here in just a second that sort of demonstrate that. But one of the primary factors that contributes to the weakness of the office of the Texas governor is the fact that we have this plural executive structure with separately elected executive officers. Okay, so as you can see, the first item says that the governor in Texas has no authority to form a cabinet. If we are tempted to apply the model of the United States government, we're going to run into some trouble pretty quickly when we start talking about Texas. Here is a organizational chart that shows kind of the prototypical model of the United States government. Of course, you know, we have the people appear through their expression of their sovereign will through the Constitution, right? And then the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The legislative branch, of course, consisting of the two chambers, the United States Congress and the House of Representatives. And of course, the judicial branch, there's sort of this hierarchical structure with the United States Supreme Court at the top, but we also have courts of appeals and district courts. But here's the area of interest here, right? The executive branch, which we see you know, the office of the president there, and within the office of the president, we have these agencies like the White House office, the Office of Management and Budget, and the others that you can see there. If you has those initials, fine. But the topic here today is not the United States, the national executive branch, right? And this you have offices within the executive office of the president. And those consist of the political and policy advisors to the president, right? But then you have the so-called cabinet, right? And I don't know how many cabinet departments are there, like 16 cabinet departments or something like that. Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, et cetera. And the top administrator at each of these departments is called what? What do we call those? Secretary. So the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense. The lone exception there, by the way, is the Department of Justice. Right? The head of the Department of Justice is the Attorney General. Right? Anyway, try to resist the temptation to digress into too much detail there. Again, the point is that you have this sort of cabinet model where each of these cabinet secretaries, or the heads of these departments, are appointed by the president. Right? And by the way, that's typically done on what basis? On what basis do presidents appoint the Secretary of the Treasury or the Secretary? For the most part, okay, people who are politically or personally loyal to the president. We saw a lot of that personal. Yeah, well, we saw in the Trump presidency, we saw the manifestation to a large extent of that personal loyalty aspect, right? But historically, mainly members of the same party and people who are, you know, politically tied, whose political fortunes are tied to the political fortunes of the president. Now, there are some exceptions to that. We have had in recent history presidents who will appoint someone from the opposition party. Does Joe Biden not have a Republican in his cabinet?
I have no idea.
Well, certainly Barack Obama did, right? Barack Obama had the Secretary of Defense under Barack Obama was a Republican, and also under Bill Clinton was a Republican. So which is an interesting choice, by the way. I think it is an attempt on the part of a Democratic president to send the message by picking a Republican to head that particular department of the emphasis that they're going to place on that. You know, like there may be some perception out there that Democrats are not as strong on those sort of military questions. So maybe they pick a Republican for that purpose. But there may be other motivations as well. So anyway, the broader point is that it's a matter of presidential prerogative. Of course, they are subject to Senate confirmation, right? As we know that sometimes the Senate doesn't just rubber stamp presidential appointments. They go through these confirmation hearings, and they sometimes will turn away a nominee, as happened with the Biden. Although that was a OMB, that was for Biden's nominee for Director of Office of Management and Budget. Okay, that was withdrawn here a couple of weeks ago. Okay, because there was no support in the Senate for it, or not enough support in the Senate for it. Okay, so again, the broad point is that we have this model, and then down here you have, I don't know, 60 or 70 independent establishments and government corporations, which are to a greater or lesser extent, depending on you have to take each one individually. Some are more closely attached to the presidency than others. Some of them, if they're what we call independent regulatory commissions, the ability of the president to control is greatly diminished, right? But certainly with other like regulatory commissions, like say Environmental Protection Agency would be an example. That's a presidential appointment and removal, okay? So anyway, there's this sort of basic organization chart. Now, what I'm trying to say is that we might be tempted to just take this model and, you know, sort of, take the office of the presidency out of here and replace it with the office of the governor, and just sort of apply this model to Texas government. But as I said, if we do that, we get into trouble very quickly, because this is not really the model for the executive branch. I mean, we have the three branches of government, certainly the legislative, which we talked about last week, and next week we'll talk about the judicial branch. You have an executive branch that we're dealing with this week, but it is disaggregated and fragmented, to say the least. Okay, so what does it look like? Whoops, I went the wrong way. What does it look like if we must have an organizational chart? Well, it's not showing here, is it? Somehow I lost the organizational chart. Well, you're going to have to create in your mind's eye until I can get one for next Thursday. You're going to have to create in your mind's eye an organizational chart where the governor is one of a half dozen constitutional executives. So you've got the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the agriculture commissioner, several others that, if you imagine on the top of this organizational chart, they are constitutionally equal. Okay, there's not this hierarchy like you see here, right? There's sort of this, the Texas Constitution does refer to the governor as the chief executive, which implies that somehow is in control, but that's more stylistic than anything else. Okay, the governor is really more first among equals. Okay, what I really want to show you I wish I had made sure that this organizational chart was in here. For some reason, it's not showing. The point I really like to emphasize there in talking about that is that each of those constitutional executives gets their authority directly from the state constitution and not from the governor. That's really the main point. Like here, when we think about, the authority of the cabinet secretaries, well, they're really deriving their authority from the president and the president's agenda, right? But when it comes to the Texas executive branch, we can't really say that. And we've had some classic, by the way, examples of how there's been very public conflict between the governor, whoever the governor is at the time, and whoever the attorney general is at the time, or whoever the agriculture commissioner is. I remember, for example, we've mentioned a couple of times in this class that the last Democrat elected to a statewide office in Texas, or one of the two, there was two that were elected in 1994. One of them was the attorney general, Dan Morales. And there were a couple of instances in which Dan Morales, a Democrat, as Attorney General, was publicly at odds with the Republican governor, George W. Bush. One very prominent issue that they went at each other publicly was over the tobacco settlement that Texas was negotiating with the tobacco companies. This is ancient history, but you'll just have to take my word for it. It really doesn't seem that long ago to me, but back in the 1990s, when overwhelming public sentiment was that there was, real dangers to tobacco, and I mean, we knew that for a long time, but it began in the 1990s. It was when we really began in the public interest to regulate tobacco heavily. Like many cities, for example, adopted no smoking ordinances in public places and things like that. But another feature of that was that there were a number of states that filed a lawsuit against the tobacco companies in an attempt to recover damages for healthcare costs and so on that the states were having to put out as a result of the health consequences of tobacco. And Texas chose not to be part of that multi-state suit against the tobacco companies, as with a lot of things like our electric grid, for example, we like to go it alone in Texas. We like to do our own thing. And the state of Texas filed a lawsuit against tobacco companies independently of those other states. And in the process of sort of hammering out a deal with the tobacco companies, George W. Bush, the governor, and the attorney Dan Morales were quite publicly at odds about some of the specifics of that settlement with the tobacco company. But that's just one example of any number of examples where we could talk about, you can't imagine, here's the point I'm really trying to get to. You really can't imagine the Attorney General of the United States being publicly at odds with the president over an issue such as that, okay? You might have an attorney general who says there's no election fraud, okay, and the president insists that there is, as you know, happened with Donald Trump and his attorney general, Bill Barr. But for the most part, Bill Barr was, towing Donald Trump's line for the years that he was attorney general. So you can't really imagine an attorney general of the United States so publicly disagreeing with the chief executive, the president. But in Texas, it's not unheard of for that to happen with other officers too, the agriculture commissioner or others that might be. Okay. So anyway, I'll try to remember to put that organization chart in there. But this is not showing up either. Damn it. Let me do this. Bear with me here for just a second. I apologize. Give me just a moment. See if it's in another version. Yeah, somehow the picture just didn't carry over. Okay, so there's the organizational chart I'm talking about if we can get the computer to cooperate. Uh-oh, this may have been a mistake. Oh, there we go. Okay, so again, that top row there, you can see the constitutional. In other words, each one of these officers has constitutional status. Lieutenant Governor, Agriculture Commissioner, Attorney General, Governor, Commissioner of the General Land Office, Controller of Public Accounts, State Board of Education, and Texas Railroad Commissioner. These, of course, are not headed by a single individual, but by a commission, okay? And this is what I'm saying, that the governor is really first among equals because each one of these derive their authority directly from the voters, from the state constitution, but from the voters. So if you have such a public disagreement as the one that I sort of described to you between Dan Morales and George W. Bush back in the 1990s, it is very reasonable for the Attorney General to take the position that I don't have to do what the governor says. I was elected by the voters of the state of Texas, and I'm going to do what I believe the voters of the state of Texas want me to do. You see how that's a very simple sort of mentality, right? Straightforward sort of mentality. Okay, here is a graphic that shows the results of a study done by 20 years ago by the Council of State Governments, showing how chief executives across the country rank. And you can see that they have Texas here as on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is very weak and 7 is very strong. You can see that Texas ranks only 2. It's really more like Florida, Indiana, and South Carolina. And down here you have the states that have strong chief executives, okay? By the way, if you're interested, this little emblem right here is supposed to indicate the President of the United States. They consider the President a moderately strong chief executive, okay? So what are some of the things that they take into consideration in this index? Well, it says here, and if you look at the bottom, it says from a maximum score of 7, chief executives lose points as follows. They lose 1 point for sharing budgetary powers with the state legislature. Right, now we're going to look at that issue, particularly as it pertains to Texas, in a little bit of detail as we go along here, but trust me on this, until we get there, you can bet they subtracted a point from the Texas governor's powers on this, okay? The governor loses 2 points for not having an item veto. Okay, now the Texas governor does have an item veto, again, which we'll detail what that means here in just a few minutes, but that would not subtract from the Texas governor. Lose a point for an item veto with a simple majority override. Again, that would not apply to Texas because it requires a 2/3 majority in both the Texas House and the Senate. Okay, for lacking this is a big one. Okay, the Texas governor would lose a point for this, and lacking authorization for reorganization. The Texas governor cannot reorganize on his or her own volition state agencies. And that has to really be done by the state legislature. Okay, -1 for facing 5 to 10 other elected agencies. That definitely would apply to the Texas governor, because we saw the organization chart where you see there was at least a half dozen other elected officers in Texas. And then -2 for more than 10, okay? So taking all that arithmetic into account, that's how you get Texas down here near the bottom. And by the way, this is just one of any number of studies that have been done over the years, which fairly consistently show that the Texas governor institutionally is among the weakest in the country, right? Let me suggest to you what some of the things political scientists look at when they're looking at the formal authority of a chief executive, and particularly governors. Do they have budget formulation and execution authority? Is the office of the governor really does the office of the governor? You got to think about budgeting as having 2 components. Okay. The first component is the formulation of the budget, okay, which is an indication of priorities, okay? And so if an executive plays an important role there, like say the president at the national level, you would expect the budget to reflect the president's priorities, right? Well, if a governor is going to play an important role in that, you would expect the budget to reflect the governor's priorities. So there's that point. In the formulation of the budget, what is the template, so to speak, for the budget? Does it come from the office of the governor? Okay. By the way, the quick answer to that, as I said, we'll look at in more detail, is that in Texas it does not. The template for the budget does not come from the office of the governor. Okay. It comes from somewhere else. Okay. And then the second component is the implementation of the budget. Does the governor, as chief executive, have the ability to manage, control to a certain extent the outlays in the budget for various departments and agencies and so on? And again, we find that the Texas governor is very weak on that. for a number of reasons, but primarily because you have these other constitutional executives. In other words, the budget, once the budget of the state of Texas is passed by the legislature, it doesn't go to the governor's office for overseeing execution. It goes directly to the departments. So the agricultural commissioner really oversees the implementation of the budget for the Department of Agriculture, or the attorney general for the attorney general's office, right? It's not a function that happens through the governor's office. Okay? Veto power. So we'll talk a little bit about how that works in Texas. Again, we mentioned a moment ago a reorganization authority. Cabinet model. We now know that Texas really doesn't have that model of executive governance. It is a plural executive arrangement. Tenure potential and appointment powers. Okay, so these are the, again, we're going to get into each of these in a little bit more detail. All I'm really trying to alert you to initially here is that these are the kinds of things that political scientists look at when they are trying to make a determination about whether the Texas governor or any other state governor is relatively strong or relatively weak institutionally. But formal authority is one thing. Institutional authority is one thing. We find that the Texas governor fares better in these kinds of rankings when informal bases of authority are taken into account. So what kind of things are we looking at when we talk about informal bases of authority? Is there an electoral mandate? It has to do with the governor's margin of victory in the most recent campaign. Think about this. What if you have a governor who wins office easily? Let's say he gets 69% of the vote, as George W. Bush did when he ran for re-election in 1998 as governor of Texas. That's astounding, 69% of the vote. Even in heavily Republican Texas, it's astounding that George W. Bush got 69% of the vote. How does that translate into an electoral mandate? If there is any reason to believe that voters vote for an officer like governor based on the agenda that he or she lays out in their campaign, the governor has a campaign, right? Says, okay, if I'm elected to a second term, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And if 69% of voters vote for that candidate, as they did in 1998 for George W. Bush, is it reasonable to conclude that somehow voters are saying, oh, I'm voting for George W. Bush because I support what he laid out in his campaign? And does that then send a message to legislators, for example, that they need to fall in line with, because that's what the voters have endorsed, right? So that's kind of what we're getting at, the political science that you're getting at there. On the other hand, if you imagine a governor who squeaks out a plurality victory, have we made the distinction here between a majority and a plurality? What's a majority? What's the kind of the criterion for? Exactly. Right. At least half plus one. That's a majority. So what's a plurality?
The most in a field of any number of candidates.
Yeah, just the most votes, right? So imagine you have a gubernatorial election where you have 5 credible candidates. You have a Republican candidate, you have a Democratic candidate, you have 3 independent candidates, which, by the way, we had that situation in 2008, I think, when Rick Perry was running for re-election. You had Rick Perry, who was the Republican Party nominee. You had, I'm trying to remember who the Democrat, it might have been Chris Bell, the Democratic Party nominee. And you had a Republican named Carol Keaton Strayhorn, who had been comptroller of public accounts, who was running as an independent, right? And you had a musician named Kinky Friedman, who was running as an independent, who got, interestingly, a significant number of votes, right? I think you had like 5 candidates that got a healthy number of votes in the county. And so I think Rick Perry squeaked out like a plurality win. I think he got like 40% of the vote. Okay? Can he claim an electoral mandate? It's much more difficult. Look, because what are his opponents going to say? Let's say my number is correct, and I'm not going to swear on it. I'm not going to bet my next paycheck, but it seems like it was somewhere around 40%. Right? What are his opponents going to say?
Majority of Texans don't support it.
60% of Texans didn't vote for you. We're not going to follow your lead on this. Right? Yeah, so that's why we look at things like the electoral mandate. Okay? Political ambition, Rick Perry certainly has that. Personal future, public opinion, staff, media savvy. Okay, so those are the kind of informal indicators that we tend to look at. And as I said, again, the broader point that I'm really trying to get at is on formal authority, institutional authority, the Texas governor usually scores pretty weak. Okay, but when we start taking into account these informal indicators, we see that the Texas governor sort of comes up the list a good deal. Okay, so let's look at. Did I not open it? Okay, hold on just a second. Again, my apologies. I thought I had all this stuff open. Huh. Let's look at one index that was developed by a political scientist a number of years ago to kind of drive this point home. He actually has two different indices here. One is based on formal authority or institutional authority, and the other is based on informal indicators. So let's indicate first where Texas is in his ranking. This is a political scientist by the name of Tad Beal, okay, who updated this thing for many years. I think he subsequently retired and doesn't do it anymore, but I think the most recent version of this is 2007. Okay, so a little over 10 years ago. The Texas governor, according to Tad Beal, would have ranked 22nd. No, that's not what that number means. The total of the index is 19, and the average indicator was 3.66, and the Texas governor ranked 3.2. Okay, that's kind of, I guess, the part we want to focus on. So it was below average in terms of formal authority. Right? And you can see how some of the other states compare. Look, here's Massachusetts, 4.3, so well above average. New Jersey, 4.1, well above average. New York, above average. Well, but then you have a few other states that are below average, including Texas, Oklahoma. You have Rhode Island here at 2.6. You have Mississippi at 2.9. Okay, so again, the Texas governor is a little bit below average here. Now let's see what each one of these indicators suggest. Okay, so you've got these headings here. Let's see what they mean. Okay, so like the first indicator that he takes into account is whether there are separately elected executive branch officials. And so he gives the governor a 5 if only the governor or lieutenant governor, if you only have the governor, or if you have a governor and lieutenant governor that's elected as a team. Kind of like the president, vice president model, right? We know in Texas that that's not true, right? You have the governor and the lieutenant governor that run independently, okay? So from there, if the governor or if you have the governor or the lieutenant governor elected as a team, and one other elected official, statewide official, like maybe say an attorney general, right? And that's a 4.5 on his scale. A 4 if you have the governor and the lieutenant governor elected as a team with some process officials, attorney general, secretary of state, treasurer, auditor that are separately elected, and down from there, right? So what was Texas on this first one? Texas is a 2. So let's see what that means. When he scores Texas a 2, it means that the governor has no cabinet, that's what he means by no team, right? And has 6 or fewer other elected officials. I think the number is 5 in Texas. So that's why he's given the Texas governor 2 on that. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the next one is the tenure potential. Okay. Okay, so if the governor has a 4-year term and no restraint on re-election, 4-year term, no restraint on re-election, gets a 5. Wonder what, and again, you can see at the other extreme, you get the governor scores a 1 if it's a 2-year term and only 2 terms are permitted. Where do you think the Texas governor fits on that? Well, what do you know about is the term of office for a Texas governor, how many years? 2 years, 4 years, 6 years? What is it? 4 years, right? And is there any limitation on the number of terms? There is no limitation on the number of terms for the Texas governor, so the Texas governor should get a 5 on this, right? Let's see. Yeah, it's a 5. We know that Rick Perry, for example, served out the end of George W. Bush's term, 3 years of George Bush's second term, and then was elected to 3 terms on his own. So he served almost 4 terms, which is the record in Texas. By the way, on this one, if we, what?
That's 15 years he was governor.
From 2000 to 2015, yeah. By the way, if we go back to the 1970s, the Texas governor would have scored much lower on this because in the mid-1970s, the Constitution was amended to provide a 4-year term for governor. Before that, it had been a 2-year term. Which, by the way, all these restrictions that we're talking about, these institutional restrictions on the governor, we haven't mentioned really, but we mentioned a little bit earlier in the semester, is really the legacy of the Constitution of 1876, right? Because remember what the Constitution makers were trying to do when they wrote that Constitution was limit the authority of the governor, right? They had believed during the Reconstruction period that Governor E.J. Davis, who was a Republican and a former Union general, Texans were Democrats and Confederates, right? So they believed that this former Union general, the Republican E.J. Davis, had abused the office of the governor for personal benefit. And when they wrote that Constitution in 1875, they were determined to make sure another future governor couldn't do that. So that's why you have all these features worked into the Texas Constitution that limit the state governor, the most notable of which is the plural executive arrangement. What better way to limit the authority of the governor than to take the power of the executive and fragment it out to a bunch of different other executives? That was their mentality. I'm not saying, when I say what better way, I'm not telling you I endorse that. I'm just saying in their minds, what better way to do that? Okay? All right, so we know what the Texas governor is on tenure potential, pretty high. AP means appointed powers. So the governor's appointed powers in 6 major functional areas: corrections, K through 12 education, health, highways, transportation, public utilities, regulation, and welfare. The 6 individual office scores are totaled and then averaged and rounded to the nearest 0.5% for the state score. So if the governor scores a 5, it means that the governor appoints and no other approval is needed. It's just the governor's unilateral power to appoint those people. Okay? If the governor if the governor can appoint a board, council, or there's legislature approval required, it's a 4, and so on. So let's see where the Texas governor fits on this one. It's a 1. Okay? So what does that mean? It means that someone else appoints, no approval or confirmation needed. So historically, this has been a source of real weakness for the executive. Now, the reason I had that 4 in the brackets red is because we've seen changes in that since Bill's formulation of the index, right? The Texas governor really scores much higher on that one now than formerly would have. Okay? Next, we have budget power. Okay? So the governor's budget power, again, I'm not going to read all of these, what each of these numbers mean. Let's just actually see what the number is for Texas, and then we'll see what that is. So again, pretty low is a 2. All right? Let's see what that means. The governor shares responsibility. The legislature has unlimited power to change the executive budget. He's focused here on the formulation side, I think. Okay? So let me talk about that first. Because we've already sort of hinted at what happens on the implementation side. What happens on the implementation side? Once the legislature adopts the budget, enacts the budget, what happens? It goes to the department, whether that's the Department of Agriculture, and then the executive over that department oversees the implementation of that budget, right? So let's set the implementation part aside and focus on the formulation side and try to make quick work of it, okay? Imagine at the national level, the presidency, okay? When you get into the part of the year where they start to do the budget formulation, right? That process really initiates with the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, which is pretty closely attached to the presidency, right? So they take all the president's priorities and they sort of hammer out a budget that reflects those priorities, right? And then that goes to Congress, and Congress takes that as the template and sort of makes adjustments. Well, we don't want this much money going with this weapon system. We'll cut back a little bit on that. We want more money going to this, whatever. But for the most part, we would think that the budget of the United States as it is formulated and as it goes to Congress for enactment really is a document that is, a product of the White House, okay? Now, in Texas, we've already said that really doesn't happen that way. Now, the governor's office does put together a proposed budget. That does happen, right? But the practice is that budget pretty much gets set aside in favor of another budget that becomes the template, okay? And that is the budget that is produced by the Legislative Budget Board, the LBB. You remember reading about the LBB in the chapter on the legislature?
Yep.
Okay, the Legislative Budget Board, okay? And who controls the Legislative Budget Board? Who are the presiding officers of the Legislative Budget Board? We hinted at this in our discussion in week 8 before spring break. We didn't get into a lot of detail because we just didn't have the time. But we talked about it in the context of the powers of the presiding officers of the legislature, the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the House. Those are the two officers that run the Legislative Budget Board, right? Which is made up, its entirety is made up of members of the Texas House of Representatives. In other words, the formulation of the budget in Texas really begins with the legislature broadly, but specifically with the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the House. Doesn't come from the office. That becomes the template from which the legislature works to create that biennial budget. Okay, so that's why the Texas governor is scoring so low on this one. And again, he's not even taking into account, as far as I can tell, he's not taking into account the implementation aspects. Okay? All right, governor's veto power. Does the Texas governor have a veto? Yes. Does it require an extraordinary majority to override? Yes. Okay? So one would think that the Texas governor would score a little bit higher on that one. Okay? In fact, does. I like to describe the Texas governor's veto power as a near absolute veto.
Really?
Yes. It's one of the surprising things, because we talk about the Texas governor being institutionally weak, but when it comes to the veto power, it's a near absolute veto power. Theoretically, the legislature can override it, but as a practical matter, it rarely happens.
Wait, the
What?
lieutenant governor or the governor?
The governor. Did I say lieutenant governor? I meant the governor.
It's
So Greg Abbott can veto whatever he wants.
Well, any governor, Greg Abbott or any other, can veto any bill. But the question is, really, can the legislature override? And the answer to that question is, theoretically in Texas, yes, with a 2/3 majority. So of the House and a 2/3 majority of the Texas Senate. So already that means that it's going to be hard to override, right? So that's one of the reasons that the Texas governor scored a little bit higher on this. It's not a simple majority vote by the legislature. It's hard to get 2/3. Hard enough oftentimes just to get a simple majority, right? But hard to get a 2/3, really hard to get a 2/3 majority. So you're going to score a little higher on that. But what I'm telling you on top of that is that it's nearly an absolute veto power because the legislature simply doesn't have the opportunity to override. And that is the result of the fact that the legislature is only in session for 140 days. So the legislature does its work, right? That's a short period of time, 140 days, from January to mid-May. They are hammering out this legislation. Oftentimes, it all comes out in a flood near the end of the session, right? And the bills go over to the governor's office. And by this time, as the governor considers signature or veto, the gavel's coming down in the legislature, and they're going back to Amarillo or El Paso or Harlingen or Longview or wherever they're from, right? So they're no longer in session. And you can't override the governor's veto if you're not in session. So if the governor decides to veto it, it's pretty much a done deal. Okay, that's what I mean when I say near. It's the result of that very short, fixed legislative session. Okay, so I'm not sure if Beal is including that in his formulation of this index or not. I have to go back and read his actual study and see what he says about that, but can't score here any higher than a 5 anyway on this, right? According to Beal's index. Okay. Now, there's another aspect here that we need to talk about before we move on to the party control, and that is the question of the item veto. Who knows what I'm talking about? An item veto.
You would?
What we call an item veto, or more fully, a line item veto. Does the governor have a line item veto authority? If so, what does it mean and what does it refer to? Yeah, go ahead. Online?
An item veto is basically they can cancel certain parts of a bill.
Okay, good. Can you be a little bit, Amin? I'm talking to Amin, right?
Yes.
Can you be a little bit more precise what kind of bill you're talking about?
So a legislative bill, if they find like any certain portion of it that they don't agree with or they don't support, they can basically just veto it.
So just any bill passed by the legislature? If the legislature passes, for example, a bill that allows for concealed carry of weapons, and then it has all these stipulations in it about circumstances that where you can or cannot carry a concealed weapon, the governor could go through and veto specific things. Well, I don't think they ought to be carrying it on a university campus. I'm going to veto that part. Is that what that means? No. I mean, you're absolutely on the right track, but we got to be precise here. It only pertains, yeah, Max?
Is it budget?
It only pertains to the budget, all right? So the governor can go through the budget, the appropriations, and if they don't like an appropriation on this line of the budget or that line of the budget or whatever, they can veto those individually, not for other legislative matters. But that's not an insignificant thing. I mean, just we say only on the budget, but that's, I mean, money is a big part of what it's about, right? So if you can control that through the line item budget, then that's going to enhance the governor's authority. Most governors, I forgot the exact number now, but most state governors have a line item budget of some kind, a line item veto of some kind. The real question is, what does it take to override it? But what I'm going to tell you here, just to make quick work of that, is that it would be no different for the governor's line item veto in Texas than it would be for a more general veto. It's near absolute. There's just really no opportunity for the legislature to override it. By the way, does the president have a line item veto for the national budget? Now, the president does not have a line item veto. Now, there have been periods in our history where some have argued, mainly conservatives, have argued that we should give the president the line item veto. And in fact, Congress did that back in the early 1990s, early mid-1990s. Passed legislation giving the President Clinton was in office at the time, giving the president the line item veto authority. The argument being that, well, it's really the only way to enforce fiscal discipline on Congress. After all, they can't help themselves. They just can't help themselves spending money. They're going to spend money. Oh, money. Spend the taxpayers' money. Just throw the taxpayers' money around everywhere. It's so easy to do. We need a strong president. We need to give the president a tool where he can stop that nonsense. Right? I'm going to veto that. I'm going to veto the bridge to nowhere. I'm going to veto the subsidy to honey producers. I'm going to veto this. I'm going to veto that. Just go in and enforce some fiscal discipline. The problem was, so said the United States Supreme Court, is that Congress doesn't have the authority to grant the president any line item veto authority. They declared that law unconstitutional, holding that the powers of the president are granted by the Constitution, not by Congress. And so if the president's going to have the line item veto authority, in order to get it, you're going to have an amendment to the Constitution.
The president can't veto, but the president can't approve where the funds go, though, right? Where the funds are allocated.
Well, there's a couple of ways to answer that question. The simple answer is, yeah, when the president signs the budget into law. Yeah. So if Congress is saying X billion, for this purpose or that purpose, then when the president signs that into law, the president's giving his approval, right? But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because historically presidents have been able to use some budgetary tools like rescissions and deferrals. President Nixon had what some people consider to be the annoying habit of using something called the power of impoundment, so that if he didn't agree with the purposes for which Congress had appropriated this money, he would simply impound funds. Like if you have your car impounded, right? Taken and set aside, he would just impound these funds. He would, in other words, refuse to suspend it. Now, one assumes he got into some trouble with that, because one assumes that if Congress passes money for purpose X, and a certain amount of money for purpose X, then Congress intends for the money to be spent for that purpose. And if the president is refusing to spend the money for that purpose, then it raises some questions as to whether the president is faithfully executing the law. Okay? Now, Congress dealt with that issue by passing legislation. I'm digressing way more than I intended to, but in 1974, in the wake of Watergate, Congress passed a series of laws that were an attempt to rein in the power of the presidency, but one of them in particular had to do with the president's use of impoundment. It's called the Budget Impoundment Control Act, severely limiting a president's ability to use that power of impoundment, which Nixon had just sort of taken it onto himself. Previous presidents had done that, but not nearly on the scale that Nixon had done. Nixon just sort of assumed, oh, I'm going to do it because I'm president, right? I can do, whatever I want as president with, impounding money, impounding funds. But Congress said, by the way, Nixon vetoed that legislation, but Congress overrode that veto. So there was overwhelming support in Congress to stop the president from doing that. Together with the War Powers Resolution, those are considered to be two very important, very significant bills passed by Congress in 1973, 1974 to kind of control what they considered abuses of presidential power. Okay, anyway, back on track here with the governor stuff. Party control, let's see what the Texas governor ranks on that. I'm losing control. Which column I'm supposed to be in here? I guess it's this one, 4. So what does that mean? Yeah, it's the last one. Okay, so what Bill's looking at here is, given the party of the governor, does the party of the governor also have a majority in the legislature? So, for example, the current governor of Texas is Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott is a Republican. So the next question is that, well, do Republicans have a majority in the state House and the state Senate? And the answer is yes. But then the next question is, well, how big of a majority? Okay. So the bigger the number here on this one suggests the greater the majority that the governor has, that the governor's party has in the legislature. The implication being that it's easier for the governor, you know, if the governor's party is in control, it's easier to push through the governor's agenda items. Okay, so those are the kind of things that that Beale is looking at here in terms of formal authority. Questions about that? We don't have a whole lot of time left here, so let's see if we can make a little bit quicker work of this other one. This other one is what he calls the personal powers of the governor. Okay, so again, if we look at Texas in comparison, you can see that the Texas governor on personal power ranks a 3.8 at the time he did this study, and the 50-state average was 3.9. So that's what I'm saying. When you start taking these kinds of things into account, the Texas governor comes up on the scale and to at least average, no longer at sort of at the bottom of the list. Okay, so what sort of things is he looking at here? Okay, he's looking at the electoral mandate of the governor. How big of a margin of victory did the governor have? We already sort of touched on this one. The bigger the margin of victory, you would think that would translate into more personal power for the governor. Okay, so at the time that Beale did this study in 2007, Rick Perry was the governor. In the most recent election, this one, by the way, is very much time contingent. These personal indicators are also very much time contingent, because it can be greater or lesser, even for an individual governor, depending on the specifics at the time, right? But at that time, the Texas governor, Governor Perry, ranked a 2, which means that he had a very tight election in 2008, only by 2 percentage points or less. That's hard to translate into an electoral mandate, a 2 percentage point win. Governor's position on state political ambition ladder. Does the governor show steady progression? You know, what's sort of in the governor's background? Well, in the case of Rick Perry, look, he's ranking a 5 on that. Again, this is 2007. So what Beale is saying is that Rick Perry showed steady progression up the political ladder. And it's true. Rick Perry started his political career elected to the Texas state legislature from a district that included mainly Haskell County. Right? By the way, he was a Democrat when he was first elected. He served in the Texas legislature from 1985 to 1991. Right? You know, he actually ran Al Gore's campaign, 1988 presidential campaign in Texas. But then in 1989, he announced that he was switching to the Republican Party. Anyway, so he started in the state legislature, and then he was elected to the state agriculture commissioner's office and served 2 terms there. That's a constitutional executive, right? And then he was elected to the lieutenant governor's office. He served 2 years. He was elected to a 4-year term, but he served 2 years in that office because he assumed the office of the governor when George W. Bush resigned to become president. So Beale is saying Tad Beal, the guy who developed this image, said, Rick Perry's showing some very steady progression up that political ladder. The personal future of the president, or of the governor, I'm sorry. Again, you can kind of see the categories here. Early in the term can run again, late in the term can run again, early in the term is limited. Well, we've already established that there are no term limits on the Texas governor. So the only real question is, where in the term are we at? So again, in 2007, when he did this, early in Rick Perry's current term, and he could run again. So it was ranking a 5. Okay. Gubernatorial job performance is about public opinion polling. So let's see where Rick Perry, it was sort of mediocre in 2007. What does that mean? A 40 to 49% positive job rating. You know, actually, you heard, remember that lecture we watched from Dr. Murray, University of Houston? He was talking a little bit about, it wasn't the focus of his discussion by any means. He was talking about, you know, the party competition. But remember, he said that Governor Perry is a fantastic campaigner, but sometimes in office he makes some missteps that cost him in terms of one example that I wonder how many of you might remember this. Maybe about the time that we're talking about here. Governor Perry proposed that all school-age girls be vaccinated for the HPV virus. And he was met with a resounding no, particularly by conservatives. How dare the governor think that he can tell my daughter she has to be vaccinated against the HPV virus, right? That's the kind of mentality, you know? So those are the kind of things I think that Dr. Murray was talking about. Sometimes he can make these miscalculations, or he could, when he was in office, make these miscalculations about, you know, a policy agenda item, maybe misconstruing his own electoral mandate. And that politicians do that sometimes. You know, they think, oh, I was elected, I have this big margin of victory, I can pretty much do what I want to, you know, I think it's important or what I want to do, but oftentimes.
Conservatives were against it?
Yeah.
Well, they're generally against the idea of the government telling me I need to do this.
Oh, yeah.
It's not necessarily against
It's
it.
not a bad-
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, but I think it's also there's certainly a large number of conservatives that would have been opposed to it on the grounds that they believe that it might promote promiscuity.
Yeah, I figured, and that's against conservatives. Conservatives have some interesting values. Same thing for liberals, but everything is, it's
Sure.
very, their ideals are very interesting.
Yeah, for whatever reason, that there was this huge conservative backlash, and it was directed at Governor Perry.
Yeah.
But that's just one example. I don't know why that one popped into my head. Yes, sir.
What year is that?
You know, I'd have to go back and look at the accounts. It seemed like it was in the late 2000s, the late part of the first decade of the 2000s. It seemed like it was around 2008, 2009, somewhere around there. I could be remembering wrong. It could have been a little bit later.
Oh, wow.
I honestly just don't remember.
So it's in the era where like Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh were campaigning against birth control, and I'm trying to remember the name of the lady, but there was a Supreme Court case where she was petitioning that, you know, Bill had to be covered by health care. And
That was a little bit later. I think that's the middle part of the last decade. You're talking about the case against Hobby Lobby that you know, wanted that to be included in the part of the health care benefit package, and Hobby Lobby was saying no, our religious values don't permit us to pay for birth control.
And that was the era of like Rush Limbaugh calling that woman a whore on national radio.
Yeah. I would have to go back and look at the news accounts to see when this HBV issue. It all runs together for me once we get, you know, past a year or two. So I have to be honest with you, I don't remember exactly when that occurred. Okay. All right, and then the last one here is the personal power index. We have just enough time to finish this off. The governor's personal power index, and we can see that Rick Perry at that time would have scored. What did I get wrong here? Oh, that's just the cumulative score. Okay, so again, 3.8. puts the Texas governor just a tick below the average for governors. Okay, so that's why political scientists more recently, when they're assessing how powerful the governor of this state is vis-a-vis the governor of these other states, they've more, increasingly been taking into account these kinds of criteria. The earlier studies, the more sort of the original studies, they only took into account the institutional powers. Okay, we only have about a couple minutes, so let's go ahead and call it a day, and we'll come back on Thursday. Maybe we'll play around a little bit with Governor Abbott's numbers. We'll see how that works out.
I have a question about something. I just thought of this.